The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
Siege, I need your help to start off the show here, because I don't understand why this Sheldon, Keefe, Johnathan, Kovacevic story has blown up the way that it has. For those who are not in the know, after the Devils lost to the Senators on Saturday, Johnathan Kovacevic spoke to the media, and to kind of just boil it down to the finer points, he made the point that his team, as they go through this point to the end of the season, they'll eventually get this playoff mentality to, help them play better. And when Sheldon Keefe was told these comments by a reporter, he said Johnathan Kovacevic should just focus on playing better. And then he walked off. And, I get it. You see it. It's very surprising. Coaches don't normally do this. But, in my head, I'm just thinking, why was this something that, people shared opinions about on Twitter? People were very surprised about it. People were asking, why didn't Sheldon Keefe do this more in Toronto when he was there? CJ, can you help me understand why this has become such a story over this weekend?
Well, to me, it just boils down to how it's not usual to get that much of a candid answer, an emotional answer from any coach about any player. I don't know that there's a whole lot that we can dig into, but the particulars here that make the story sell, I think it's really more about just that clip. I mean, it's awkward. You can imagine yourself being in that room. I mean, not only does Keefe say what he does, he cuts off the questioner a little bit. He's like, Johnathan Kovacevic has to play better. How about that? And then there's a bit of a quiet, and then he walks off. So I think it's the clip. I think that really that's what it does. Anyone who says, though, why didn't he do more of this in Toronto? I would take them to task that they probably weren't paying close enough attention, I would say, because the one thing I came to know about Sheldon in his time when I was around the Leafs a fair bit when he was the head coach, he did run hot after losses. That was definitely, that's a pattern that you could go back, even to his days in the American Hockey League. And I'm sure, I wasn't around him when he worked in Sault Ste. Marie or even before that, but he's an emotional guy, and you would get some of the most interesting answers from him, quite honestly, right after a game, because I don't know, just whatever's coursing through him, whatever filter that you probably don't want to go down. I'm sure coaches, I've never been on a podium taking these questions, but I'm sure coaches are like, don't say this, and they just try to steer around it. Right. I think in those moments you can't do it. And so, quite honestly, how I interpret it is and this isn't where it's not Kovacevic's fault, because reporters shouldn't, I don't know what kind of question it is to be like, the player said this, and what do you say to the player? Because really what he said back to the player is, talk is cheap, right? He's saying, let's not talk about a playoff mentality. We have to see, you have to play better. You have to play like you're in the playoffs. Anyway, you're right. It was I would say a small bit of a head scratcher, but for sure I've seen that version of Keefe when I've been in the same room, in his days covering the Leafs. He quite often after games would maybe go a little far or say something specific about a player or group of players. There was, kind of a famous one in Toronto about him calling out, he was asked about the loss to Arizona, and he said something like, basically our top players weren't any good. And we, if you look at everyone in the middle of the roster, we're even. So, he basically called out all his top guys in one moment, and then he walked it back, and we don't have to really relitigate all that. But my point is there is a pattern of behavior there. And I do see this as fitting into that.
I still don't think what Kovacevic said was all that wrong, though. You can say that, they need to play with a playoff mentality, and 9 times out of 10, when players speak openly that way, they put themselves in that. So I just felt that Johnathan probably, I don't know the guy at all. I don't know what he's like in that locker room. I don't know if he's a selfish guy or if he's one to point fingers at other people and not himself. But when I hear those comments from Johnathan, I'm thinking, okay, everyone, including myself, we need to get on this page. And then for Sheldon Keefe to go out and say that, it's like, okay, you have a point. You're right. You got to show it. And maybe he hasn't been playing all that well. But even then, I just thought that was a really weird way to end that presser.
Yeah, look, it feels like he's a little bit a victim of circumstances in the sense that he was one of the guys tapped to speak after that game. And then that comment gets relayed to the coach when the coach is seeing red. there's nothing on the surface that screams why he should be called out. In fact, he was on one of the Devils' only defensive pairing that wasn't a minus in the game against the Senators. I mean, I know that there's a little bit more that goes into the coach's evaluation than simple things like that. He did take a penalty in the game. He's had a few recent strict games here, if you notice, where he has been on the ice for some goals again. So I don't know if it's maybe stemmed from conversations that they've been having, but I do think on a bigger scale, look, there's a lot of pressure building around the Devils. They have, the injured players they have out, it gives them an excuse in a sense to not play well, but it's not a coach's job to view it that way. The coach is trying to coach everybody else up. I think they've won 4 of 10 games. They're sliding closer and closer to where the Rangers, even though the Rangers haven't exactly been lighting the world on fire, but they still are within reach. And so I'm sure that the temperature is going up around everything. And Kovacevic, we should mention, just signed a $20 million extension at the deadline. So, he's an important part of the team. He's someone who's had to work to get to that point, obviously bounced around Winnipeg and Montreal before landing in New Jersey, but getting, that bit of stability. He's, counted on to be a bedrock member of their team. And so, I'm sure all that goes into the stew, but I do think that we're at risk of maybe overanalyzing something like this, because as I mentioned, I just think it was the wrong question at the wrong time to a coach who, can get a little spicy at the mic. And I'm sure something like that's addressed behind the scenes later. It's probably, look, lots of coaches have used the honesty button though. I mean, John Tortorella is probably the most famous of today's coaches that's still around that has never shied away from a bit of conflict, a little bit of open honesty, look behind this door and this is what's going on, challenging his players publicly. I mean, those are all part of his kind of, his coaching tool belt. That's certainly something he's used. I think Sheldon maybe doesn't go quite to Tortorella's level or lengths at that, but I mean, he's definitely, look, he played for John Tortorella. If you want to go all the way back to the Tampa days when Sheldon was in the NHL, John Tortorella was his coach. I mean, I'm sure whether it's even conscious or not, some of that maybe has been stamped on him over his own career in hockey. So, interesting times. They got a big game now against Vancouver on Monday night. And, I just think we're seeing the strain. I mean, so there's going to be a theme. I know we're going to talk about all kinds of different topics on this show, but I think like an overriding topic is just the strain of this time of year now on so many of these teams, on so many individual players, injury situations, performance related issues. Like this is for the teams that already know they're in the playoffs. This can be a long, tenuous part of the schedule because you're just trying to get through. You're just trying not to embarrass yourself. You're just trying not to get hurt. But, there's a huge chunk of the league right now that, I guess the very bottom side of this is, we've heard Andrew Burnett talk in Nashville this week about how hard it is for those guys to get up for these last games. They have so many veteran players and obviously they're so far out of the mix, but there's a lot of teams sort of between those two poles that I mentioned that are just grinding through it right now. And I think this is the sort of stuff that comes out of that situation.
You talk about that strain and injury stuff. I mean, New Jersey, they're in a really fascinating position. You don't have Jack Hughes. You don't have Dougie Hamilton. When I was watching the game yesterday, near the end of the game, at one point, Luke Hughes was hobbling off the ice. He came back. He seemed fine. But like, if that's one team where it feels like you're standing on this shaky foundation, you could still make the playoffs. But with a couple of games to go, the Rangers are trying to get themselves going. The Islanders still have a chance. Columbus, an outside chance in that division too. Like, it sort of feels like New Jersey, at least we kind of pictured them as a sitting duck. But man, when you think of some of the injuries that have plagued them these last few weeks, like, it's hard not to. Right.
But missing the playoffs for them is still no option. I mean, look, you and I can look at it and we can be rational. Look how many goals, how many minutes are out of your lineup, the superstar quality, the game breaking ability. You don't just insert that in, but I mean, the coach has got to find ways around that as best he can. That, the players do too. They all have to embrace whether it's a new role or getting, a bump up in the lineup, making good use of those minutes. I'm pretty sure Sheldon Keefe has never coached a team that missed the playoffs. I might be mistaken on that. Certainly I know his time in Toronto with the Maple Leafs, he didn't. I don't believe he did with the Marlies prior to that in the American Hockey League. And I read the stats somewhere, but I didn't fact check it. Anyway, put it this way. He's a coach who's had a high amount of success, consistent success. And the Devils put themselves in a position where they were a comfortable playoff team before, really this bad rash of injuries hit them. So I just feel like there's, as much as we might look at it and be like, well, this just wasn't your year when you lose your top center and one of your top defensemen. I mean, internally, it can't be viewed that way. I mean, the playoff games are experience for younger guys in the lineup. You never know if you get in and Markstrom gets hot. Maybe you win a round. It's obviously dollars in your owner's pocket, which I'm not saying the players or even the coach are thinking about in this moment, but there's a lot of downstream effects of needing to make the playoffs. And so for them, they're trying to sort of turn this slow slide into the abyss around. And it'll be an interesting day. I guess, part of having the Canucks there means you'll have the Canucks media members there. Might be a question or two about this Kovacevic thing from even outside reporters, not just those day-to-day tasked with covering New Jersey.
By the way, you're right. Sheldon Keefe has never missed the playoffs as an NHL head coach. Just
right. And in the AHL, I don't think either, but
correct.
I mean, the point is that's 10 years, right? It's 10 years is an eternity for a coach. To have that, I'm sure that's in his mind. That's why he got paid what he got paid. And he was out of work precisely about 22 minutes, I think, after he and the Leafs parted ways, right? I mean, I know it was a little longer for the official deal to get wrapped up, but New Jersey was courting him right from the minute and said that he was free. And so, when you hold yourself to a certain standard, when you've had that level of success, part of it, I think, quite honestly, is things like this, where it's probably not his best moment behind the mic, but again, I've seen it before, and it hasn't hindered those past teams from getting through and winning a lot of games.
I wanted to ask one more Sheldon Keefe question, and you're kind of touching on it. I'd love any insight you can provide on what it was like whenever Sheldon Keefe would be up at the podium in Toronto and say his players needed to play better, and how that would shake out for those guys.
Well, I think every player might hear that differently and might get it, hear it through their agent or their friends or their parents or whoever is listening on their behalf. So it's hard for me to gauge what happened behind the scenes after those moments too often. But what I can say is, like, the one thing I always liked about working where Sheldon was a coach is that he was always unfailingly honest. And I feel like he never really, I mean, look, I'm sure that there's things that every coach can't say in a moment, specifically when players are injured and the coach is getting asked about that, and things of that nature. But in general, you never felt like he was skirting questions. He never shied away from hard conversations. If it was one of his stars that was maybe going through a tough time or, not scoring as much as expected, all those sorts of things. Like, I feel like he always met those sort of questions head on. Now, it's an entirely different media environment he faces in New Jersey. I know Amanda Stein, who works for the Devils. I saw her at the Four Nations tournament. She was mentioning there are days that she is the only, media member in attendance for Devils media availability. So that's obviously a little different than what he faced in Toronto. But I'm sure. I'm just sure the next time Sheldon's in front of the mic, he'll just be honest about what this was, and he'll probably unlock some mysteries. He'll either say maybe, look, that's just a player that's been struggling, and I don't know what. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but as I say, I do think that he's the kind of guy that will, I guess that's how you get in this situation to begin with, in a sense. He doesn't have as much of a filter as some others, which I, as a media member, will say is a positive, but it might have some negative consequences at times or negative outcomes.
Montreal's own Amanda Stein, by the way.
That's there you go.
Friend of the show. We'll just throw out the title friend of the show at anybody. Not anybody, but like there's a lot of people who could get it. And Amanda Stein, definitely one of the best in our business. We should talk about New Jersey's next opponent, the Vancouver Canucks, and the game they played on Saturday against the New York Rangers. The Rangers didn't need to fire that many shots, but they, including JT Miller, still getting the best up on the Vancouver Canucks. Did you watch any of the game? I caught most of the third period of that game. Obviously riveting stuff, the back and forth between both of those teams. What did you think of how that game played out if you followed it? And what do you think of where Vancouver is placed right now? And we can get into the Rangers too.
Well, it's one of those games you don't need to look up the deserve to win-o-meter, because when one team has like 39-12 in shots, and even though in this case the team with 12 won the game, it was a bit of an unlucky result for Vancouver in a sense, or, unfortunate for them that they couldn't find a way to lock that game down, maybe get a couple more saves, maybe score a couple on the other end of the ice. But yeah, you're right. It was an entertaining game because it's two teams fighting for their lives. They were going back and forth there in the third period. And, unfortunately for Vancouver as well, they saw Elias Pettersson and Niels Höglander leave the game injured in the second period, not return for that third. And so obviously, again, when you're in it with a team that it's like every game feels like it's life and death, it's tough to lose players of that magnitude. Remember, the Canucks are already down Philip Hedl, who's out with a concussion. So when Pettersson went down, that leaves them down their top two centermen at this point in time. Not too many teams would survive too long without their top two centermen, no matter who those two players are. And so, we'll see where Vancouver ends up here. But it was a very difficult loss. The kind of loss, if you're inclined to view it this way, that you might think, that's just a sign it's not our year, that the playoffs aren't going to be there. But, I still think they have enough time remaining. They play New Jersey. They got a game against the Islanders still. I mean, they're trying to mimic what Calgary just did. They can't. Calgary just beat all three New York area teams.
First time in franchise history that's happened.
There you go. But they've kept their sort of slim playoff hopes alive in doing so. If you're Vancouver, you're just trying to find a way to win those last two games and see where you end up. And again, they don't have to be pretty. I mean, maybe you got to win a game where you're on the wrong end of the deserve to win meter, but you grind one out. And amid all this, I don't even know if you saw it, but Thatcher Demko is back at practice and
saw that too,
and is looking to at least back up maybe on Monday night. He might be getting thrown back into the mix here. I mean, this is almost a time, and I'm not saying anyone's doing anything irresponsible, but the sort of injury timelines become suddenly a little more vague because of what's at stake, and players are going to try to play through what they can. But the Canucks are in a difficult spot, but you never say never. It's been they and the Rangers have both had those years that you're just like, feel like that you could write a book about either season, and the reality is both teams might be done on April 17th. There's a world that neither the Rangers nor the Canucks make the playoffs.
By the way, flipping it to the Rangers perspective, I want to give a shout out to the homie Peter Baugh, who wrote a really great story on how JT Miller was approaching that game against the Vancouver Canucks. Just reading one quote off of this, it's going to be a war. And off of like the little bits we saw from the game, like him like bumping into Quinn Hughes, kind of, hacking at Elias Pettersson during the game. Look, I have my thoughts and feelings about how JT Miller can be as a guy or a player, but in this game, we need a villain. And he had no problem being a villain for his team against the Vancouver Canucks. And I kind of like that he played that role, and I have no problem with him playing that role. And it worked out in the favor of the Rangers.
It did. And look, that's who he is, what he is. All kinds of different styles of people rub people the wrong way. I mean, it's hard to find harmony in any 25 person room of adults from different backgrounds, different countries, different ages, different everything. One thing I don't remember where the quote came from, but I saw from Miller recently. He was basically saying he doesn't mind being known as the guy who's pushing for excellence. That I think he said it's something of a lost art. He thinks like the give a shit meter essentially for, it's definitely not his quote now. I'm translating it through CJ speak here, but essentially he was saying that he doesn't mind being known as that guy that wants to push the envelope and push everyone to be better. And you see it in a game like that. And I'm with you. Good on him in a way. He gets a empty net goal on the game. He hasn't been scoring as much lately, but there's a real competitive fire there. And obviously there's a lot that went on. I mean, I don't think it's not like that gets really addressed in a hockey game. But that was a pretty tumultuous last season for him, especially with the Canucks. And I think it's worked out well for where, he loves being back with the Rangers. And, as I say, this is a weird Rangers year. I'm not willing to say that they're headed into obscurity. I think that it'll be an interesting offseason no matter what happens from here on out on Broadway. But, he's ended up in a good spot, and, we'll see where the Canucks are. It's just hard to get your mind around that because I don't even know who's lining up for them when they play New Jersey on Monday night.
Lost in all of that in that Vancouver New York Rangers game, the wonderful tribute for longtime broadcaster Sam Rosen, one of the greatest in our game. I'm a big broadcaster, play-by-play nerd, and Sam Rosen's one of the best to ever do it. So, very early stick taps for Sam Rosen, who's retiring at the end of the year.
And Sam, you've probably seen this or taken note of this, but it's been kind of like incremental, like teams that are going through playing the Rangers for the last time this season. I know the Leafs did it this last week, presented him with like a signed jersey. He's getting honored all year long. It's kind of in a way we don't have a lot of that in hockey, it feels like. And obviously this is a broadcaster versus a player, but I've seen it more in baseball, right? I remember Mariano Rivera's sort of farewell tour the last season. I think it's really nice. And you're right, Sam. I mean, I don't even know the number, but he's been calling Rangers games for like almost 50 years. Certainly my entire career and then some before that. So, it's cool to see him going out, getting his flowers, so to speak. And, you saw even when Ty Domi was at the game the other day, he held up a Sam Rosenhart photo. So it just feels like it must be crazy. It's hard to imagine having that kind of career, quite honestly. The reason he's getting honored this way is because very few people do. And then to have so many different ways of being honored or must be a little strange because you're used to being sort of behind the mic and behind, away from the cameras. And, he's getting a lot of love these days.
Siege, who's your favorite broadcast voice to listen to in hockey nowadays?
Bob Cole. I know that's not the spirit of your question, but Bob Cole was my guy. I mean, basically all the biggest moments that happened in the NHL when I was a kid happened with Bob Cole on the mic. I mean, I think it's almost for anyone, it's a timing or a regional thing. It's where you grew up, basically where you were listening to games and then what era or what time, what team maybe, but I just think of, I know I've cited it a lot, but his call on the Joe Sakic goal in the 0-2 men's gold medal game at Salt Lake City. So many, oh baby, like I still feel like I say, oh baby to like in conversation to people, and that would be entirely because of him. So that's the main voice. I mean, we have so many pros, but I'm sure if you were like my age and you grew up in the US, you'd probably say Doc Emmerich, maybe like it's like ice cream flavors. I think broadcasters like that. You can like a whole bunch of different styles. Like it's not necessarily one is better than the other, but Bob Cole is like the forever voice of hockey in my mind.
That makes perfect sense. I think of guys like, there's the obvious ones like a Gord Miller. I'm a big Chris Cuthbert fan. Doc Emmerich is one guy I liked, but one guy I loved, speaking of growing up in the States, there's a generation of fans who grew up listening to Gary Thorne. And I think Gary Thorne's one of the greatest broadcasting voices in the sport has ever had. Like,
I feel was Gary Thorne on one of the video games I grew up playing? Yep. Like, I feel like I know him more from the video game just because I didn't grow up where I watched him on TV, if that makes sense.
So he was definitely a voice when when the 2K had NHL rights and they had like the ESPN NHL series for a bit. He had that voice, but I think there was a brief period where Gary Thorne transitioned over to the EA Sports side. But definitely growing up,
like pipes.
The first. Yeah, absolutely. And then like you go back to like, I remember when I was a Syracuse Crunch intern and there were a couple people in the office who were big New Jersey Devils fans. And we were talking about when the Avalanche beat the Devils in 01 to win the cup. And like the biggest thing you remember from that night is like Gary Thorne calling the cup raise for Raymond Bourque. I was like reciting that in the office. I got a lot of nasty glares that day from all the Devils fans in there. They were not happy about that.
Yeah, you were agnostic in that exchange. It was just a great moment you remembered. You didn't care about either team per se, but
no.
It's funny. I don't know if you saw this, but Chris Cuthbert appeared on Richard Deitch's show recently, and he mentioned that he did not like his golden goal call in 2010.
Really?
That even though obviously it's an iconic call because the moment is so big. And again, especially if you're Canadian and you're seeing highlights of that game, or if you watched it, you almost certainly in the English language, of course, would have heard Chris Cuthbert's call. But he was saying he much preferred the call he put on the Connor McDavid, the Mick Golden goal.
Interesting.
In the Four Nations face-off final. And he just said with Crosby, because it was, part of what makes that goal unique is it was a goal scored from a place you're not used to seeing a puck go in. It was a broken play, right? With the referee at the sideboards, just kind of a weird one. And I guess he didn't like his pacing or timing. Now of course we all remember it well because it's such an iconic moment and that's the voice that went with it. But, I can't imagine doing the play-by-play job. I mean, we both have written stories. Of course, we can go back and look at what we did, the decisions we make. With a story, you get a little more time to get it right. With the, play-by-play, you're trying to, it's a moment and you want to meet the moment just right. And that it would keep me up at night trying to make sure I could do that if I was in that seat.
There's a part of me that like has like that dream of still being able to do that. And I don't know if I'll ever be lucky enough to do that. But like there was, going back 10, 15 years, there was a version of myself who wanted to be in that chair, who wanted that responsibility. I don't know if I'll ever get that opportunity, but like, I think that job of calling a game and making that moment, like the moment when you call it, I think that's one of the coolest things you could do. And I look at people like a Chris Cuthbert or Gord Miller or so many people who have been in that chair with so much high regard. So I can do a whole podcast talking about that stuff. It's amazing.
We didn't plan any of this, but get this. So on Saturday night, I was at a family member's house, someone who I wasn't familiar with their setup, and I couldn't figure out the sound, and it was driving me crazy. I got the game on, but I couldn't find the sound because I just love hearing the play-by-play. I eventually did, but it just shows you, for me, like I'm the opposite. Like I love it if you're ever out at a bar and you want to watch a game, like I love it when they play the sound. And even when I'm in someone else's rec room, I'm like, I need the play-by-play here. I know I can watch this game, but I want to hear the announcing too.
I'm very lucky. I know we'll get to other stuff here, but I'm very lucky in the Sens like press gallery where my seat is. It is directly below the visitors booth. So like if the Rangers are in town, like Sam Rosen is calling the game and he's directly above me. If it's like an Amazon game, like John Forsland, another one of my favorites, he's like basically directly above me too. But like you can go through the Colorado guys, Boston guys, go up and down the list. Like I get like the visitors like perspective, like right above.
What's wrong with me that I'm immediately thinking like, who wouldn't you want to hear? Like you don't have to name it. We're not giving out cross checks for bad broadcast. There would be the odd one though. You'd be like, oh man, do I have to be sitting here tonight? Yeah,
I don't know. I can't think of anyone who I don't like. I mean, I guess you could, if you guys who are listening or watching, you can leave your comments below. I don't know. Be nice, because there are people who get a little crazy with that stuff. But like, yeah, I generally like I don't have a problem with many of the broadcasters, but like there's definitely a couple that like I consider among my favorites. And there's a lot of really great talents who are working every day in the league, like Brendan Burke or John Forsland as another example as well. I mean, I try to give love to Pierre Hood in French. Like a lot of people growing up in Montreal, even Anglophones, who might not like what they were seeing on CBC or TSN. They would watch the game in French. I learned a lot of my French watching RDS, and a lot of that was thanks to a guy like Pierre Hood. So yeah, there's so many different people I could go through. I would love to do like some kind of like rankings or something like that, but maybe that's for another time. Maybe that's not for this podcast.
We basically just did it.
Unplanned. Anyway, before I nerd out more, I was trying. I had thought about doing a good segue off of the McDavid golden goal and talking about how Connor McDavid out injured alongside Leon Draisaitl. Neither of those guys played over the weekend against the Seattle Kraken. Just wanted to know off of what you've been hearing about how long they may be out for the Oilers.
Well, the good news is this isn't one of the situations where every game matters. And obviously it does. The Oilers are trying to finish as high up the standings as they can, get home ice advantage in the first round, all those things. But they don't need to potentially press either guy back into action too soon. And so, my sense here is that there's really not much concern about either McDavid or Draisaitl, that these are going to be relatively short-term absences, ones where both the player and the team can take a little bit of time because they have it at their disposal. And I think everyone recognizes, especially a team like that and players like that, who dragged that team right to Game 7 of the Cup final last year, that they know what's on the horizon pretty quickly. So it doesn't sound like Draisaitl will be too far off at all. I think a little bit longer for McDavid, but nothing where you're worried about them missing even the run up to the playoffs. I don't think. And so, pretty minor situations is how it's been described to me. And probably a big sigh of relief, just knowing. I mean, even the fact that the game that McDavid left the other day there, he was seen afterwards, around the arena talking to some fans and things like that. I mean, obviously when a player's in more distress after leaving a game, they're not usually mixing it up. So all the signs are very positive in Edmonton, and we'll see what's to come. It's been kind of an interesting season for the Oilers. They were my preseason Stanley Cup pick. I'm not feeling as hot about that now, but part of making a pick is you got to stick with what your gut told you back in October or September, whenever we did that. So, I think that it's there for them, but can these guys get healthy, get on top of their games, especially McDavid, right? This hasn't been a McDavid year. I mean, we'd all love to struggle in the way he struggled. It's still one of the best players in the league, like without question, but he hasn't maybe reached his peak level of dominance just yet. And, I think he'll take the time he needs to make sure he has a chance to do that in April, May, and June.
Julian, McKenzie, Chris Johnston, both of us feeling uneasy about our cup picks. I picked Dallas to win. I'm terrified of the Colorado Avalanche. Haven't seen them up close. Terrified. I know they blew a lead against the Montreal Canadiens and they won in a shootout. Terrified. They did so much to change their team and they just look so dominant, man. I think Dallas still has enough to... I'm still going to pick them if it comes to Dallas, Colorado in a 7-game series. But man, I'm terrified.
Yeah, you shouldn't jump, though. I mean,
I'm not jumping.
It's a free country, so you can do whatever you want.
I'm allowed to be scared. I'm allowed to be scared, though.
But it looks way better to be like, I called this back on September 27th on our episode.
Yeah.
Like, you might as well just ride with it at this point. That's kind of my thinking.
Yeah. Just really quickly here, like, can I just give a shout out to Calgary here off the fact that they won 3 games off that New York trip, the first time they've ever done it. But like one guy I kind of want to mention here. Did you know Johnathan Huberdeau is like on the verge of like a 30-goal season? He's like quietly having like a bit of a rebound. He has as many points. He has more points than he had last year. He has as many as he had in his first season. But like 27 goals. He's quietly having like a decent year in Calgary. He's kind of turning it around a little bit. I don't know if that's something that other people have noticed around in NHL circles.
Yeah, I mean, I was aware that he was putting up some points, but I didn't know the exact numbers. The tough thing is he's paid to be at the top of the league, right? I mean,
oh yeah.
And I do think at a certain point, and I don't even want to take this conversation somewhere we don't need it to go. I do think at a certain point, maybe with the cap going up, we're not going to view every player just through the prism of what that player's paid. And, how does that equate if it's, X percent of the cap and all that stuff. But, that's part of what's hung around Jonathan's neck there, right? Is just, he had his career best season in Florida, gets traded and then signs that $10.5 million deal before he's even played for the Flames. And he's had trouble producing at that level where he hasn't been able to since. So, but you're right. Good for him for getting through that stigma. And look, he's been a big part of their success this year. Do you know what? Here's another piece of trivia since we're just like off the script right now.
Cool.
So since the Four Nations break ended, if I were to say which player in the league do you think has the most points, one guess, who would it be for you?
Most points since the
February
Four
20th
Nations.
is basically when that ended.
Brady Tkachuk.
No.
Damn, because he's been on a point streak since then. So I figured it was him. Is it Huberdeau?
It's Sidney Crosby.
Oh my god!
Which is it's just kind of a cool stat.
That's
because
cool.
he had a great Four Nations tournament for Canada. I think he was the third leading scorer in the tournament. And then now that's where he's at here. And look at a lot of other names you'd expect to be up there. Nick Suzuki, who's obviously been part of the Canadiens' hot run. McDavid, Draisaitl, Panarin, like they're all up among the leaders. But I just thought it was interesting that Sidney Crosby is right there at the top as of now since February 20th. And he's basically now guaranteed himself of that 20th straight point per game season because of this surge. He just needs a couple more points to get there.
You remember, I think like the first Saturday after Four Nations was over, someone put up some graphic saying like, oh, well, here's a whole bunch of these major players for Canada. No one's picked up all these points. Like the only guy to score that first Saturday back was Sid. Like,
right.
What a player, man.
I mean, it's unfortunate because he's doing that under the context. And look at Pittsburgh's been winning too. So, yeah. I mean, maybe in Pittsburgh, they haven't ruled out their own team making the playoffs, but I mean, he's done it under the context that this is the last hockey he's going to get to play this season right until mid-April. But anyway, just wanted to shout that out since we're just all over the map today.
One more thing before Ask CJ. Where are we at with NHL expansion? A story coming out a couple of days ago about how the NHL has identified billionaire Dan Friedkin as an ownership candidate for a potential team in Houston. And I think it was Kevin Weeks who a couple of days ago said we could see as many as 36 teams. I know we've touched on expansion before on the podcast, but what are you hearing about that possibility?
Well, what's notable here, I mean, look, Houston's been on the horizon for a while, been on certainly the radar at the NHL level. You know, they were talking to a different potential ownership group prior to this. And, you know, you look at where Dan Friedkin is at. I mean, he's someone who's amassed a tremendous amount of wealth in his various businesses. He's recently purchased Everton, in England in the soccer league there. Owns a team in Italy, professional team, was a part of the bidding, although not a successful bidder, to get the Boston Celtics in the NBA. So obviously he's someone who's expanding his portfolio in sports. Then on top of that, you know, the core of his business is based out of Houston, you know, in the auto industry. And so, you know, I think it adds up to that. Probably, I'd say at this point, being the most likely next destination for the NHL. You know, Atlanta's still very much in the mix. There's been a couple groups with interest there. You know, both of those groups, it's, you know, you need an arena to have a chance at the team. And so, you know, we'll see how the pacing goes when it all gets announced. Maybe you have a 33rd team join first and then a 34th, kind of the way we saw when Vegas joined as the 31st team and then the 32nd Seattle. Although those were two separate expansions, this might all be done in concert, but just with a lag between them. But certainly it seems like it's getting closer to that being a reality, just because you have, you know, such a well-heeled owner that the league has acknowledged publicly that they're speaking with. So, you know, I still think that the most pressing business is getting hammered away at the CBA. You know, as we mentioned earlier, that those talks are due to start in a week or so formally, but there's been work that's already happened there. You know, the NHL also needs a new Canadian TV rights deal, which is a huge piece of business. You know, obviously the deal that is coming to its end with Sportsnet was a 12-year deal, was a record-breaking deal at the time. So, you know, those are probably when we're talking about like major business for the NHL's head office, those items got to get ticked off first, I would think, but then not too far beyond that. I think you're going to hear more and more about expansion. As I say, I think it will start with Houston, could probably include Atlanta at some point, and we'll see where they go, because there's been lots of other cities that have shown interest. And, you know, the one thing the NHL does feel, I know there's been sort of commentary on this, but having 7 Canadian teams does change the math for them compared to other sports leagues in North America, right? I mean, you know, I think it's fair to ask the question, is there enough talent to support this? What does this do to the playoffs, division alignments, like schedule matrix, like all this stuff? Those are valid questions. But the NHL, when you're just talking about having enough markets that could support teams, I think the NHL is in a unique position because you have 7 Canadian markets that can do that. Whereas obviously there's only one Major League Baseball team in Canada, one NBA team currently in Canada. And so there's a lot of these big metropolitan US cities where they don't have teams as of now. And so, you know, when you couple that with what I think is going to be expansion payments, definitely north of $1 billion, maybe north of $1.5 billion, you know, at a certain point, that raises everybody's value of their franchise in the whole league. And obviously it's a lot of money. So, yeah, that was Emily Kaplan of ESPN had that story first this week, but she's bang on that Dan Friedkin and the NHL have accelerated conversations, and, you know, it's starting to feel like more of a thing that's going to wind up with them getting a team when the timing's right.
Shout out Emily Kaplan. I saw that we had that up at The Athletic. I will definitely give a shout out to Emily Kaplan for breaking that story. I'm here to say, I mean, Houston, Atlanta, all I hear in my ears right now are people asking, what about Quebec City? Why can't we have a team there? Why? We don't need to get into all the logistics about
I can
why.
answer that one in 12 seconds.
All right, you're on the clock.
What owner wants to pay between $1.5 billion and $2 billion US dollars to get a franchise to operate it in a market the size of Quebec City?
You didn't even need 12 seconds.
I'm not. Here's the thing. Like, I'm not making this is not political. This is not my personal views. I actually just think it's straight business. Like, it's at the point where, you know, it's hard to operate a team in those sorts of markets. I mean, if a team's in distress in the future and the league has to move it somewhere where they know people are going to care about hockey, sort of, we call that reluctantly the Winnipeg 2.0 model. That's how the Jets came back. Maybe it happens, but Quebec City is not a big financial market. Obviously, neither is Winnipeg compared to Houston. I mean, anyway.
No, don't stop yourself. Don't stop yourself.
Well, because it's hard because I don't want to stomp on people either. Like, I think the passion of a lot of people that live in these cities, and there's people that grew up and love the Nordiques.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not stomping on their passion. I'm not saying their passion isn't worth something, but unfortunately, pro sports is a massive business, and I just don't think the dollars and cents make sense.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, but there's also a part of me that would still love to see a team there, just like I'm sure there's a part of you that would still love to see that happen. You're not saying
I would love to go there.
100%. Quebec City is a great city, and if we had NHL hockey there as a regular thing, we'd all love it, but we also understand the business side of it. It is what it is, essentially. I didn't mean to go into Ask CJ on a downer, but you've just...
No. Well, I mean, but I also didn't want to, let's not dance around the obvious, I guess, is kind of what I'm getting at.
100%. Let's get into questions sent by listeners and viewers like you. Sent over Twitter, X, as we're calling it, Blue Sky, and Discord. Shout out to everyone on the SDPN Discord. Let's start with this one from Cody Brown. Which team is having the worst buyers and or sellers regret from the trade deadline? As their own example, the Leafs with Scott Laughton and Detroit for not selling.
Well, I haven't thought of this, and it's a hard one to rip off to say who has the most. I'll say the one thing with the Scott Laughton acquisition is he signed through next season, and so I do think that it's hard to judge him. It's hard to judge whether they have remorse or not after 9 games. Now that's not getting around the fact that the 8 or 9 games he's played have not gone well with the Leafs. He's yet to put up a point, had a potential goal in Nashville on Saturday night, called back because of a high stick. It's been a tough go, but with someone like that, you would have far more concern if you gave up a first round pick, which the Leafs did, and he was a player on an expiring deal, because he's still got a whole another season to make good for you. And who knows, maybe more beyond that, because it isn't a short-term situation. I think that's a big reason why some teams are scared of rentals, is because it doesn't always happen right away. And then I think it can snowball. Like, if you don't get off on the right foot, and, I'm sure there's a lot going on in the player's life, and then they're putting more pressure on themselves. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I don't think the Leafs would be at the top of the list, although, there's got to be some worry there. And obviously with Scott Laughton, the Leafs play the Flyers on Tuesday. There's going to be some attention on that here at the start of the week too, with him playing his first game against his former team. I don't know. Detroit not selling. I don't know. That's tough. Sorry.
Buffalo on Dylan Cousins, that Josh Norris trade.
Yeah. Here's the thing. This is a good question. I feel like I shouldn't half do it. And I'm just going, I'm that's one of those ones that actually requires some thought, and I haven't thought about it in that context. So let's come back to it.
We'll go back to it. We'll add that to the pile. We'll add that to the pile of future ideas,
because it is a good question, honestly, and I think it's a good exercise for this time between the when those decisions were made and the playoffs. So,
let's go to one from NHL Trade Alert. Chris, do you have a favorite trade that you broke?
Ooh, it's funny. Fans always think of this stuff.
Yeah,
like my brain doesn't really go there in the same way.
You're the insider, of course they're gonna want to know behind the curtain, man.
But sometimes I like trade, like something like that where there's a funny story, so it's not like the magnitude of the trade.
Yeah, that's what I'm expecting from you. Like, I don't think there's there's obviously big trades and big stories that people are talking about. I remember
at the draft, this is a way back when. This is maybe like 2015 draft, I want to say.
Yeah.
I broke a trade about Eddie Lack getting traded from Vancouver to Carolina. And I found about that trade in a really funny, random way. Like, not in a way that even all these years later, I'm not comfortable sharing exactly, but that's not nothing. Like, it's funny. So I'll tell you this much. I was with a couple other people that might call themselves insiders recently, and we were having a chat, and it was a more honest one than I can be into the microphone. And we were sharing the odd story where we really found out about it in the most roundabout, random way. And there's there's the odd, funny story where, for as hard as we try to break news, and a lot of it, quite honestly, just comes through official channels that you might guess. But the odd time you sort of find about something. And like, that's like what I think of more than the significance. Like, quite honestly, breaking news is still part of the job. And like, I won't deny that, but it's not the be all and end all in a world where it gets confirmed within 12 seconds and then you're writing hits. Like, it's a little different world than even the one I first came up in the media environment. So of course you want to be the first, but I think my personal view is it doesn't mean as much as it used to. And so maybe that's why it all just kind of passes by in a blur for me.
From Flex Luther, question for both CJ and Julian. Of the likely first-round opponents for the team you cover, which city would you like to travel to for 2 to 4 games? Thinking only about the city, state itself, and what you would do with your own downtime, not thinking about the quality of the on-ice matchup, press room snacks, etc. As of Saturday morning, when the question was asked, the likely cities seemed to be Sunrise, Miami, Tampa, Toronto, or DC for me, or Sunrise, Miami, Tampa, Ottawa, or Montreal for Siege.
I mean, it's easy for me. Ottawa. I've got family in Ottawa. I love the city, and I haven't spent much time there in the last few years. My man Julian's there. Most people, I would say this, most visiting reporters say they would never want to go to Ottawa, not as a slight on Ottawa, but logistically it's a pain in the ass to drive out to the arena and you want to stay downtown. And like, it's not the most easy place to cover a game. And it doesn't have the weather of Tampa or Florida, but I've spent a lot of time in both those places. My personal choice would be Ottawa this year.
Toronto would be my pick.
Dude, you didn't have to do that. You could have if you went Florida and you wanted to wear your sunnies on the off days, I get it.
Here's the thing. I definitely want to do that, but I also want a Battle of Ontario. I have a ton of friends who live out in Toronto. Also, in terms of traveling, taking a train or driving to Toronto, a little easier versus being on flights all day, going from Ottawa to wherever in Florida. I guess Washington's a decent middle point because there's a direct flight there. I don't know what it's like flying from Ottawa to Florida, but like, yeah, I'm cool with taking the train.
I always think it runs too, and the idea of running along the Rideau in the spring feels nice to me right now.
Yeah, I think so too. Anyway, thank you to everyone who sent in questions. There was a lot, so even for next week, we could tap back into some that's there, but also just keep those questions coming. We love tapping into these questions as best as we can. We'll get back to it later this week with a brand new episode of the CJ Show. Siege, great work as always.
Thanks, my man. And we didn't even get into Patrick Maroon, but
oh my God, yes,
he's retiring.
Maroon.
We'll get into him too. Maybe he's a stick tap on Thursday.
He is. He has to be a stick tap. The fact that he made the announcement with Darren Pang before the Chicago-St. Louis game on Saturday, a longtime veteran of the game. We know about the Stanley Cups, the big rig, as he's known around these parts. I think the game's going to miss him. What a personality.
He just hit 1,000 total games too if you add up playoffs and regular season. It feels like that's he outkicked what would have been expected of him. So good on him, Patrick, and wish him the best.
Absolutely. That's a great way to end the podcast. Sorry that we ended up kicking him to the end, but I mean, things happen sometimes, but I think that's a great way to end the podcast. Awesome. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.